I want to thank Rachel and even in his absence, Senator Kyle, for organizing this wonderful afternoon, which I hope will have a more substantial purpose than simply a bunch of people getting together and scaring the living hell out of one another, and out of the non-participants as well. We've been talking about all manner of possible assaults, both cyber, non-cyber, state, non-state actors that could affect the economic health of this country. Because the means of conducting these assaults are so varied, and to the extent that they rely on technology constantly evolving, I think it's fair to say that the law, as we conventionally think of it, is an increasingly feeble tool with which to combat these kinds of assaults. And in fact, one of the principal lessons I'm going to draw today is that if the one thing we can do is make sure that the law stays out of the way of developments in private industry and in private industry and government cooperation, because if you think about it, the possibly the most lawyered war that we've ever had is the current war on terror, and our experience, I think, has been that the law has been better at getting in the way of combating it than it has been at combating it. In order to understand how feckless a venture it is to try to create a set of rules that will, particularly international rules, that will control the kinds of forces that we've been talking about. I want to take you back over a century to the year 1906, when Russia, which was disadvantaged by a then new technology of hot air balloons, backed an effort to outlaw aerial bombardment. And in fact, at the first Hague Peace Conference in that year, the Russians proposed a ban on what they called the discharge of any kind of projectile or explosive from balloons or similar means for a term of 5 years, and it was adopted. The following year, when the advantages of aerial bombardment began to be perceived, the ban was reinstituted, but it applied only to undefended towns and villages, which is to say, when it came to aerial bombardment in support of conventional warfare, all the bars were down. Now, this example seems quaint, but it illustrates two approaches that are sometimes attempted to try to restrain feared military potential of advancing technology. The first is to prohibit certain kinds of activity outright, and the second is to try to limit it. There are some relatively primitive practices as to which an outright ban has been moderately successful. The use of poison gas in warfare is an example of that, but even there are, of course, some regimes that have used it both against their own people and in international struggles. Think back on the Iraq-Iran war, and you can think about the limits of international conventions of that kind. The limitation approach with respect to nuclear weapons, I think we're watching that unravel right before our eyes. I think it should be no surprise that as to the matters we've been talking about, it seems unlikely that a regimen of rules, however widely concurred in by public and private agencies, are going to limit resort to economic warfare through the various channels that are open to both state and non-state actors. Reliance on any government is at least problematic. For example, in the cybersphere, the Defense Department is authorized to act with respect to threats to the .mil and the .gov networks. It may, under some circumstances, be able to warn of a cyber attack on some part of the .com network. But as General Keith Alexander, director of the Defense Intelligence Agencies, has said, in many cases, the only thing his agency is authorized to do is to watch the screen and say, ooh, that's going to be a bad one. As to the criminal law, it punishes unlawful intrusions, unlawful damage of the sort that we've been describing, but it acts after the fact. And obviously, we want to create, ideally, a system in which people cannot act before the fact. I think private actors within the .com domain, as Stuart suggested, can certainly set up their own detection networks and keep, if we keep the legal channels sufficiently open, can cooperate with the government in strategies that will not only detect, but in some cases punish the hijacking of information and the destruction of systems. It's difficult to get private companies to go along with these cooperative activities. The first reaction tends to be, what about our secrets? Won't they become known to other companies? Firewalls and clean teams can get around that, and I think companies have shown themselves in recent years to be more and more receptive to that kind of activity. I think government can contribute. It does contribute in a plotting sort of way. I hadn't heard mention today of something called the CFIUS process. It's one of those splendid government acronyms. It stands for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It's an interagency group that passes on the acquisition by foreign persons and entities of interests in U.S. companies that, for example, have defense contracts with the government. It's comprised of representatives of the Departments of Defense, Treasury, Justice, State, and Commerce at a minimum, and it passes on those foreign acquisitions. Of course, the downside is that there has to be a government hook in order to do that, and the government hook is generally a government defense contract. Obviously, the government cannot be passing on all foreign acquisitions. We live in a free society, a society that has a bias in favor of the free movement of capital and the free movement of people. But we can, it seems to me, monitor and disclose, requiring disclosure from listed companies, requiring disclosure of foreign holdings from companies that are regulated through the exchanges and otherwise, is one approach that will at least allow people like Rachel to figure out who owns what and how much. There is a bit of good news in all of this that I found plotting through the particularly dense verbiage of a book on international law. And I came upon the following passage. It says, "No international convention to include the Charter of the United Nations defines threat or use of force, armed force, or armed attack. And despite decades of earnest work, the international community has failed to define aggression with any clarity in any other document." And here's the bold type. "Existing international law that governs the use of force must therefore be derived from a heuristic analysis of how the Charter use of force paradigm has been interpreted through state practice." Now, believe it or not, that's actually good news, because you know what it means? What it means in plain English is, it's not what they say, it's what they do that counts, which is to say, it's not what they say, it's what we do that counts. And so long as we can focus on these problems and act freely in the international arena, we may be able to overcome some of the problems you've heard about this afternoon. Thank you very much.